For months, something about Marcus felt different to the people around him, not dramatically different in any way that announced itself or produced a single observation anyone could point to with confidence. Just different in the way a room feels different when something has been quietly removed from it, when the absence is more present than any addition would have been, when you look around trying to identify what is missing and find that everything appears exactly as it always was. Marcus lived in the same apartment, worked the same job, followed the same pattern of days that the people in his life had long since stopped thinking of as remarkable. Nothing visible had changed. And yet the people who spent time around him kept walking away from interactions with a feeling they couldn't accurately name, a subtle and persistent sense that something about the experience of being around Marcus had shifted in a way their usual vocabulary wasn't equipped to describe. Nobody could explain what had changed because they were looking in the wrong place entirely. The first theory was confidence. It seemed obvious once someone said it out loud. Marcus carried himself differently in conversations. He responded to challenges without the particular quality of effort that effort used to require from him. He moved through difficult situations with the steadiness that read from the outside as someone who had arrived at a settled relationship with themselves. Confidence, that was it? Except the confidence theory started coming apart at its edges almost immediately. Confident people still needed things from the people around them, still sought confirmation in the specific small ways that confidence and approval-seeking coexist in most people, still adjusted themselves in response to certain social pressures even when they appeared not to. Marcus had stopped doing all of that, not reduced it, stopped it. And the people who had always known exactly which lever to pull to redirect him found that the lever had been disconnected from whatever it had previously been connected to. That wasn't confidence. That was something else entirely. The strangest part was that Marcus hadn't gained anything obvious. He had lost something. This was the detail sitting at the center of everything everyone was noticing without understanding. The thing that would have clarified the entire picture if anyone had been looking for a loss rather than an addition, but no one was looking for a loss. Because when people change in ways the people around them can feel, the assumption is always that something has been added, a discipline, an achievement, a realization that produced new capability. Nobody thinks to ask what was removed. The evidence of the loss was everywhere once you knew what you were looking at. Criticism arrived at Marcus and seemed to travel a shorter distance than it used to before it stopped. Arguments ended faster, not because he had become more agreeable, but because the fuel that had kept those arguments burning had stopped being available. The specific forms of social pressure that had always worked on him, the particular combinations of disappointment and subtle withdrawal of approval that people deploy without always knowing they are deploying them, found that the mechanism they had always operated through was no longer responding. People became frustrated in the specific way that people become frustrated when something that has always worked stops working and no explanation is available for why. And this was when the second layer of the question revealed itself. Because frustrated people began saying something that was more accurate than they realized. They said Marcus had become impossible to manipulate, not difficult to manipulate, not less susceptible than before, impossible. And that observation, once made, didn't fit the confidence theory at all. Confident people can still be manipulated. Confidence and manipulation resistance are not the same thing. Something deeper had changed. The answer was hiding inside something so ordinary that almost nobody thought to examine it. What Marcus had been carrying for most of his adult life was not visible in any form the people around him had been equipped to see, because the carrying had been so constant and so thoroughly integrated into how he operated that neither he nor anyone else had been treating it as a choice. He had been building his identity out of the reactions of other people, not consciously, not through any deliberate decision to make their approval the material from which his sense of himself was constructed. But through the accumulated habit of checking constantly and below conscious awareness what the people around him thought of his choices before he had finished deciding whether the choices were right. Through years of explaining decisions to people who had not asked for explanations, as though the decision required their endorsement to be valid. Through the long practice of defending his direction to people whose understanding of that direction was not a prerequisite for him moving in it. Through the specific exhaustion of negotiating his identity in conversations with people who were never qualified to define it. All of that had been running continuously, consuming something real, shaping what he reached for and what he avoided. And then, gradually and without any single identifiable turning point, it stopped. Through the quiet and accumulating recognition that the permission he had been seeking had never been anyone else's to give. What disappeared from Marcus was not weakness, it was dependence. The people around him continued constructing explanations and continued finding that the explanations didn't quite fit, and the misfit was itself instructive even if none of them found their way to the instruction it contained. They thought he had become confident. Then they noticed that confident people can still be moved by the right pressure, and Marcus could not. They thought he had become successful, but there was no specific success they could point to. They thought he had become free, and freedom was closer than confidence had been, but it still didn't fully account for what they were experiencing in his presence. What they were experiencing was the complete absence of the mechanism through which he had previously been reachable. Not reachable through pressure, not reachable through disappointment, not reachable through the particular social currencies that move most people in most directions when applied correctly. Marcus had stopped outsourcing the most fundamental thing a person can outsource. He had stopped allowing praise to constitute evidence of his worth, which meant he had simultaneously stopped allowing criticism to constitute evidence against it. He had stopped performing his identity for audiences whose reading of the performance had been shaping the performance itself, in ways he had never chosen and never examined until examining it had become unavoidable. The thing everyone had been feeling in his presence was the absence of invisible chains, not the presence of something new. The absence of something old and heavy that had been carried so long it had come to feel like a permanent feature of who he was rather than a weight he had never consciously picked up and had simply never thought to set back down. People thought Marcus had changed into something more than he had been. What they were actually witnessing was the disappearance of something that had been controlling the version of him they had always known. And once that disappeared, the version of Marcus they thought they knew disappeared with it. Not because he had become someone else, because he had finally stopped being something he had never actually chosen to be. The greatest transformations rarely come from adding something to yourself. Sometimes they come from finally understanding that the weight you have been carrying was never yours. And that putting it down was never a loss. It was the first moment of genuine freedom you had ever allowed yourself to feel.